All right. Now we will see. Let's see here. Our attendees are coming on in. Welcome, attendees. So while people are joining us, we can just go ahead and just start with some of the welcome slides and do a roll call with the work group. Does that sound good, Sean?
Yeah, that's good. I also see some of the attendees are in fact panelists, so we'll just need to, I imagine folks will be being transferred over as we kind of continue on. Thanks, Ingrid, for doing that.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid, for being on top of that. Yeah, I do see that as well.
Yeah, and did you want me to share screen?
Sure, yeah, let's go ahead and share screen, get our slides up. Welcome everybody to Housing Capacity Work Group meeting number 5. Glad you could all join us. I'm Jamie Damon. I'm the facilitator for our work group, and I've got just a few introductory slides here while people are still joining us. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Just a reminder of our Zoom meeting tips to keep yourself on mute, put yourself on video if you're comfortable. Helps us feel like we're all in the room together. For our panelists, our work group members, the chat function is available for you to use. We ask that you not use it for side conversations or substantive conversations, but more to let us know if you're having technical issues, if you need to leave. If for some reason your audio isn't working, you need to put in some, a question, that would be great. But do use your audio and video as much as possible. So we appreciate that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. A few more meeting tips. It looks like everybody's got their names on there, but if you don't have your name, if you could name yourself, that would be great. You can go down to the participants list. You can see everybody that's here from the work group. You can also see who's here as our attendees. Welcome attendees for observing this meeting today. And then the raise hand function, of course, is under reactions. So there's where the raise hand is, but you can also just raise your hand and I'll be watching for that as well. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which is our agenda. So our agenda for today, we're scheduled to be together until 4 o'clock. And the purpose of the meeting, as you saw in the meeting packet, is to discuss the draft recommendations. And kind of like the last meeting, we're going to stay in a large group and we're just going to go through each one of the recommendations. Sean has a brief little presentation about each one of the recommendations, as about 5 minutes or so, just to orient you. We hope that you've taken time to read them in the packet. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of your feedback and input on each one of the recommendations. And then we'll wrap up and do next steps before we go. So it's a very discussion heavy meeting today. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide and we'll do our work group roll call. So you see we've got our work group members here on the screen. Go ahead and we'll start with Brian, and just let us know you're here, check your audio video, and we'll move on down the list. So Brian.
I'm here.
Welcome. Lucia. Not seeing Lucia. Ryan.
Present.
Welcome. And we heard from Al that he can't join us today. Alan Lazo. Not seeing Alan. Bill Van Vliet. Van Vliet.
And
Bill,
Van Vliet, and I'm here.
Is it Van Vliet? It is.
Yes.
Van. Welcome, Bill. And then let's see, Brianne or Brian.
Brian's here.
Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
And Brian Lutz.
I'm here.
Welcome, Brian. Chris Faulkner, I see you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Dave Honeycutt.
I am here, Jamie.
Welcome, Dave. Emily Ryman. Not seeing Emily. Garrett,
Yeah, good to see y'all.
good to see you too. Welcome, Garrett. Heather, I did see Heather. Heather O'Donnell?
Hi.
Yep, I thought I
Nice to
saw
meet
you.
you. Sorry, I waved silently.
Got to test your audio too. Jeffrey Adams? Not seeing Jeffrey. Brock Nation?
Here.
There you are. Anybody I missed who is substituting for anybody else? Kathy, I didn't say your name.
You've got a whole nother list.
On the other side of the slide.
Oh,
Apologies about that.
yep. Is there another slide?
No, it's just, are you not seeing the
There it
entire
is. Never
slide?
mind.
Oh,
Never mind.
okay.
Nope. I see it. All right, Jim.
This is Ariel Nelson. I'm actually the LOC's representative on this task force. He was just substituting for me when I was on maternity leave.
Great, thanks, Ariel. Jonathan,
I'm here.
welcome. Justin? Not seeing Justin. Karen? Not seeing Karen. There's Kathy.
Yep.
I usually have a different list that I work from, so thank you for pointing the double columns out. Marianne?
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting. I'm here.
There you are. Hi, Marianne. Mary Kyle?
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Mary Kyle. Matt?
Matt Lawler from Marion County is here.
Welcome, Matt. Michael?
Good afternoon.
Hi, Michael. Peggy?
Peggy Lynch, I'm here, but I wish I was at Waldo Lake where I'm supposed to be.
I'm sorry, but welcome. Peter? Peter Gutowski? I thought I saw him. Nope. Samantha? Nope. Ted or Annalise?
Hello, this is Ted.
Hi, Ted.
Annalise is here as well.
Hi, Annalise. And Ping?
Yiping is here. Yeah, I apologize. My camera somehow had some trouble. I don't know how to fix it. Please bear with me today.
You're coming through just fine, Yiping.
Okay.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to the, so did I miss anybody now? Instead of the whole other half of the list?
Jamie, Lucia also is here. I
Okay,
from attendees.
thank you. Anybody else, Ingrid?
No.
All
That's
right, perfect. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Meeting guidelines, same ones we've been using every time. Fully participate in the work group meetings, come prepared. We hope you had a chance to read the recommendations in the meeting packet. Participate in an open and mutually respectful way. You'll hear differences of opinions, that's expected. You're a diverse group. Balanced speaking time. Again, we want to hear from everybody. So if you're not speaking up, we want to hear your voice. If you are speaking up a lot, be mindful of how much you're speaking, make space for others. Serve as a liaison to your larger community of interest. We know you're bringing those forward to this conversation, and act in good faith. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which is our meeting outcomes, which we already talked about a little bit, but it's a good handoff to Sean. And so again, it's really focused on conversation around the draft recommendations. And we have several questions that we're hoping that you'll address for each one of those, and that'll become more apparent as a part of the presentation. Sean, you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could put maybe today's meeting in a little bit of context, right? So last week, we had sent out a set of kind of discussion draft recommendations, right? We've been in a period of, kind of more open-ended discussion over the past three, guided but open-ended discussions over the past 3 meetings. And now what we really hope to do is to get a lot more specific, right? So these recommendations, right, were released last week. One thing I wanted to mention too is that we're also releasing today a set of kind of draft overall recommendations. And this is when this work is going to start coinciding more just with the Oregon housing needs analysis more generally. These are going to be part of those core recommendations, right? And will be included in the final document. So really the point here is, we've had these conversations where we've talked about these ideas at the high level, what seems to be potentially something that could work, something that might not work as well. And we've taken that feedback and we've translated it into a set of discussion draft recommendations, right? And really the point here is to start diving into some of those specifics. So what we'll do, the draft recommendations is organized by the kind of 4 points of legislative direction that we were prescribed in this process. And really what I'm hoping to get out of today's meeting is to, kind of review them. We have them organized in the same way as they're organized in the report, so you can follow along if you want to make sure that you are tracking it, you have all the details in front of you. And really what we're looking for are 3 major things. The first one is for any particular recommendation or for a set of recommendations, what refinements are going to be needed to make sure that it is implementable, effective, and politically viable. The second piece is when we think about, right, any policy has potential, unintended or undesirable consequences. What might those be and how could we ameliorate that, right, in the final recommendations? And then, of course, right, we also recognize that a lot of these are in some ways going to be controversial. We recognize not everybody's going to like them all, but what we need to know now are what are the alternatives, right, that will fulfill the legislative direction, right? That's kind of the main thing what we're hoping to get out are specifics rather than kind of, the general like ideas of the UGB expansion process. Okay. So any questions just about that basics of the meeting outcome? I'm going to spend just a little bit of time overviewing like what are the core of the recommendations based on how they're organized, but just questions. Yeah, Peggy.
I always have questions.
Please.
Peggy Lynch, Legal Women Voters. So now that we have the CHIPS Act and we have seen the discussions by a different task force on a different set of land use issues, at some point, how are we going to be, or how is DLCD going to be wrapping the housing need with the industrial lands need discussion?
Can you describe this process? This is my first time hearing about it.
The governor's task force has recommended or is looking towards being able to use the federal CHIPS Act to increase industrial manufacturing, and frankly, particularly in the Silicon Forest, although they don't say that particularly. The governor has asked for 4 air quality DEQ people to help process permits. That implies that we might need additional land for industrial, for these industrial uses. And that means that we have a conflict or additional demand. And I see that Gordon is ready to answer my question.
Well, Peggy, that's really, this is the housing capacity work group, and that is a different item. It's employment land, a new issue, sort of new issue that has arisen and is being looked at really on a separate track from this. And frankly, we don't see a relationship. This is the attempts to increase, well, I suppose UGB changes could impact employment land as well. But that effort is really focusing more on larger employment potential users, which I don't think these recommendations really address that. That would be a separate item going forward.
I just wanted to make sure that it was on the table, that we are not just talking about land for housing, but we are also talking about land for jobs when we look at the broader discussion. And I realize this group isn't supposed to be dealing with that specifically, except for the fact that it will be interesting to see if the PSU pop forecasts and whatever change related to the potential for these additional jobs, which means additional housing needs. Okay, I'll let you get back to your official agenda.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, I'll acknowledge too that some of these recommendations are going to have overlap. For example, if we have more funding for Goal 14 and actual dedicated Goal 14 staff, that will be a very significant resource for local jurisdictions to tap into. Again, our charge was very specifically housing, so that is our focus, right? All right, any other questions? Brian?
Yeah, just to add a little bit more to what Peggy said, because like Peggy, I like to talk and respond. One of the beginning direction from the legislature on this topic of housing needs was looking at our commercial and industrial lands as opportunities for housing, and knowing that the governor is now pushing the industrial jobs and the land needs. I think that we need to be very cognizant and aware that eroding that for housing purposes is something that probably is a conflict and we shouldn't be pursuing.
Yeah, and you'll see that reflected in the recommendations too, right? Because we do address that specifically in the implementation of efficiency measures. We provide that as an option for jurisdictions. It's not a, you must rezone all of your employment or commercial lands for housing or anything like that. So you'll see that reflected as we go through today's discussion. All right, let's move on. Okay. So these are slides that you guys have seen before, just a kind of, quick, reminder on the scope of this process and what we're doing. Again, apologies for the redundancy here, right? Just a reminder on the work group role. I know you guys have seen this slide every time that you guys have participated here today, but just to start out with this, the role of this work group is to advise DLCD staff, right? This is kind of a parallel track that has been part of our Oregon Housing Needs Analysis project. We're actually at a stage now where we're going to start melding the two processes together into a cohesive set of recommendations on housing, and this will be a core part of that, right? And really your role is to kind of provide just a set of diverse perspectives and share knowledge and experiences, right? And it's not intended to seek consensus necessarily, but really trying to understand what is going to be a set of viable recommendations that we can bring back to the legislature. And of course, to the extent practical, right, we're bringing in, to the extent that we can, knowledge from the Housing Needs Work Group. One thing that I didn't mention on this report that we are going to be publishing today, this is a broader set of reports just on housing more generally, right? So as we're focusing on this specific slice related to kind of the intersection of Goal 10 and Goal 14, there's a lot broader set of recommendations that are really seeking to address housing at a much broader scale than what this conversation here is today before, but it's a part of that. All right. Okay. And again, just a reminder on the legislative direction, right? We've talked about each of these individual pieces of legislative direction in the past 3 meetings, but what we haven't done yet is kind of step back and say, all right, how are we addressing all of these 4 points? And that's what we'll be doing today. And the discussion draft recommendations, this is, we provided it in your packet materials. We also have a link where you can access this. This will also be included as an appendix item to the draft report that we released today. Still noting, of course, that it's a discussion draft and still subject to significant amounts of refinement before it's finalized and published along with the report. But if you wanted to access it, you could access it at that link. And of course, as we get through today's discussion, I just wanted to provide a quick reminder on what these recommendations actually are. They, again, are organized by the way that they're laid out in the report, and they're organized by the 4 bullets of legislative direction, starting with utilizing land within the urban growth boundary. And these 2 recommendations relate to our conversation 2 meetings ago, talking about the prospective of implementing efficiency measures in the housing production strategy, and to adopt rules that support kind of housing diversity and production as part of the housing production strategy, and really broadening the scope of efficiency measures rather than just focusing on kind of narrow slices of land efficiency, and more broadly on just housing production and diversity generally. The second piece is establishing need for a UGB amendment. This all relates back to the housing capacity analysis and ways that we could make that process both more accurate and less of a kind of onerous burden for jurisdictions. And some of that includes kind of putting more methodological burdens on the state. That includes replacing the 20-year projection with the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, as well as providing kind of more local discretion on translating that to housing types in a way that is responsive to the need and market feasible. The second piece is adjusting the statute in the buildable lands inventory to better reflect a realistic 20-year need, and removing kind of inappropriate lands or discounting lands that are constrained in different ways. And there's kind of some specifics there. And then the third piece is directing kind of administrative rulemaking to provide more methodological tools, safe harbors, kind of assumptions in relationship to a lot of these factors like market factor adjustments, that type of thing, to again reflect a more realistic 20-year housing capacity. Then we get into the regulatory review of a UGB amendment. This was the conversation that we had in our last meeting, where we talked through, initially it was kind of 5 ideas. They're kind of organized a little bit differently now, but many of these are that we talked about last meeting. The first one being emphasizing providing funding for and streamlining the urban reserve and concept planning process to make it a more useful pathway for local jurisdictions. The second piece is further kind of facilitating urban growth boundary land swaps, which is an option that many jurisdictions pursue today. The third one is kind of developing a small scale streamlined UGB amendment, something modeled off of something like the Affordable Housing Pilot Project, that's House Bill 4079, in exchange for achieving statewide housing goals. And then the fourth one, kind of hearing the need for, kind of reduced, risk of appeal alongside kind of desires for something more resembling kind of a clear and objective track, is amending the simplified urban growth boundary methodology to do just that. And then finally, right, recognizing that this is going to obviously take a lot more capacity building at the local scale, especially for cities below 10,000. There are kind of 2 specific pieces of recommendation there. The first one being actually funding Goal 14 related work, right? We have a agency request budget for $2.5 million. What we kind of note in the recommendations is that it would take more funding, especially if you're trying to do things like public facilities planning to really facilitate well-planned and timely urban growth boundary adjustments or amendments. And then the second one is with the new agency staff that we would be onboarding with that request, really focusing them in on Goal 14 to provide not just guidance for local jurisdictions that are seeking urban growth boundary amendments, but also, just capacity to even be able to do off-the-shelf Goal 14 analyses or BLIs on behalf of smaller jurisdictions, or even just providing significant development expertise to get land ready for development too. And they would be part of a kind of broader housing production team at DLCD. This coincides with one of the recommendations in the report, which is to establish an interim housing production team that can start coordinating and getting projects built. So with that in mind, right, we're going to pivot to our discussion. I'm going to provide more of this text. Sorry, this is going to be a very text-heavy set of slides. I don't have any fun graphics for you all this in today's presentation. But really it's really just for reference so that we guys have them in front of you. And again, you have the document that you can track along with. And we're going to just go through each one of these sets of recommendations. And really what we're looking for is feedback on these 3 questions, right? The first one being the types of refinements that you think would be necessary to make one or several or a combination of recommendations more implementable, effective, and politically viable. And to the extent that you are able to, please be specific. It's really important that we start getting specific feedback at this point in the process. The second piece, right, is how do we address any potential unintended or undesirable consequences of a particular policy option? And how do we ameliorate that? And then the third one, right, recognizing that, these might not all be the best recommendations, right? That's the point of a discussion draft. We need alternatives, right? So what are your proposals? If there are other policy avenues that we should be pursuing that really fulfill the direction that was prescribed by the legislature, please be, to the extent that you can, please provide us specific feedback there. And so with that, I think I might pass it on back to Jamie. So that first topic that we talked about, utilizing land within the UGB, that's the first part of that report when you dive into the actual bulk of the report. And they really consist of those 2 major pieces. The first one being implementing efficiency measures, adjusting statute to implement efficiency measures as part of a housing production strategy, and provide that kind of streamline for jurisdictions as more of a check rather than a stop in the process before they move on to the UGB expansion process. And then the second one is adopting administrative rules that kind of do a variety of things on efficiency measures and provide a lot more clarity about, what does it mean to adopt an efficiency measure, and really broadening it to ensure that it's all about, right, providing, setting up production, getting land ready for development, providing diverse choices for folks. And also recognizing too, just all the work that cities have been doing recently with the adoptions of House Bill 2001 and more recently climate friendly and equitable communities rules. So with that, I think I will pass it on back. Let's start the discussion. And Jamie, yeah.
Great, thanks, Sean. And so Arpana is going to go ahead and put the 3 questions in the chat so that you've got them right in front of you. So Arpana, if you can go ahead and do that. And so just thinking back to the 3 questions, there they are in the chat. So just, you know, it really is, we have about 15-20 minutes or so for each one of these topics. So just raise your hand to get in the queue and share with us your thoughts on those questions. Anybody want to jump in and start? Kathy, go ahead. There
I
you go.
wanted to note that in terms of, I lost the question. How people should go about implementing the legislative guidance. We have not talked at all about how one should weigh or consider or add in land that is currently employment land or commercial land. And I think that is something that would be helpful to include.
Yeah, so in the report, when you look at subsection E there, as you kind of see, there's kind of a mention of like one of the options that could be for a jurisdiction to, as an efficiency measure, would be, say, if they say have, for example, an abandoned Kmart and a giant parking lot, and that would be like a ripe area for redevelopment potentially, right? Or another example that I heard is in the city of Coos Bay, where they have lands that are, I believe, owned by the port and are zoned industrial, but they'll never really be used for that. Those types of opportunities to clarify, hey, it would be an efficiency measure if you rezone that for, you know, either housing or a mix of uses. That's part of that subsection E. I apologize, it's not on the slide because, well, this is a lot of text already, right?
Right. Okay.
Any other thoughts, Kathy, on any other questions related to this one?
I don't think so.
We've got the floor. Okay. Garrett, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak up in favor of how this is moving here. I think this is really smart in rulemaking whenever you can take, you know, what's existing, and then a lot of new laws have been made and find ways to collapse and just better get the housing production strategy, which I think has grabbed a lot of attention and where people are putting their focus on, and mirror it and match it up and marry it to these kind of existing efficiency measures, and using this more as a check on your way towards the UGB instead of a full kind of stop in the process. To me, from a process efficiency standpoint, that plays really well. And so I don't have any kind of what I can see kind of unintended political consequences or where this is going, if we can couch it in the fact that we're trying to make this really kind of marry up what's existing and what's been recently proposed with this system. That to me, this really fits well in aligning with those goals.
Thanks for that, Garrett. Mary Kyle?
Thanks. I agree with Garrett. I like the focus leading with the housing production strategies because, but maybe for a slightly different reason, the housing production strategies and should be led with by every city, and many cities are not going to be ever or for a very long time looking at UGB amendments, and yet they should all be looking at whether their current zoning and investment strategies and other policies are actually meeting the needs, the housing needs and location type design and affordability inside their urban growth boundaries. So it shouldn't be tied to a stick or a carrot of an urban growth boundary. Obviously it feeds into it for those that do go that way, but I think it's really critical to lead with the housing production strategies. So I'd like to lead with that emphasis. It's not so much about UGBs, it's about housing production strategies. And then just to make sure I understand like how kind of the phasing of all this, let's say the legislature says, go forth and do this first one. Is that when you would explain in more depth what is meant by accountability mechanisms, making sure jurisdictions have meaningfully followed through, that they've made progress towards implementing efficiency, words like that? Is that a rulemaking detail that you anticipate as opposed to trying to put this into legislation. And I would suggest rulemaking if you get to go ahead. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, the report will actually include a lot of details on that specifically, but the what we kind of note in there is that with the implementation of housing production strategies, we do have an existing accountability framework that starts off, kind of collaboratively working with jurisdictions to make sure they have the resources they need. Then
Right.
it, kind of ramps up, right? If there's
My question is just actually kind of a bigger scale. Is it accurate to say that if the legislature tells you to go forward with this, then you're going to like play all those out in detail in rulemaking? It's not going to be in the statute per se. You might have a lot in your report to the legislature for what it is you're talking about, right?
Yeah, and we don't have any recommendations to change the existing tools of like how the housing production strategy is implemented, including the review process or the accountability tools that the statute provides. We don't have any suggestions to change that or recommendations to change that.
Like on the, this new phasing of the housing use of the housing production strategy, making sure that rather than tying it to an urban growth boundary, but still if there is an urban growth boundary expansion, that a local jurisdiction have made progress towards implementing the efficiency measures. That's going to be played out later in rulemaking if you get to that point, I assume.
I believe, yeah, we'll have to clarify that situation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
having, oh, sorry, did I cut somebody off? Okay, having efficiency measures as a check is really beneficial. Speaking from experience, when the city I'm on the planning commission for went through this process, we were looking at a UGB expansion, got to efficiency measures, found out we were woefully underprepared. So it was an all stop, went through a process, got that all done, thought we met the benchmark, and then 2001 came around, found out we were still way behind the curve. So I think having it as a check mark, but also using that as a tool in the event that there is an urban growth boundary expansion to encourage the proper mix and things of that nature. So you're identifying those, and I think what it really boils down to is just neighborhood fuel. When you have, we have a lot of areas with a lot of single family residential, and they're that way by design. And so I think that encouraging mixed use or multifamily as a function of the UGB expansion is also super helpful. But I think that using that as a tool then could reduce some of the political sort of backlash, rather than saying you have to do all this efficiency stuff first before you move forward. I think that has a high probability of reducing some of the political strife.
Thanks for that, Matt.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Ariel?
Thanks. I think Mary Kyle mostly asked my question just to emphasize or put a finer point. I was just curious, how this would work to actually implement if this recommendation, were directed by the legislature, how the timing would work out in terms of when the rulemaking would take place in cities who are currently scheduled or will be scheduled for their HPS work. And just if you've thought about the timing of that and how it overlaps with other rulemaking and implementation requirements coming out of DLCD from the last year or so, and that you anticipate. So just hoping, I don't expect to have a specific answer right now, but just hoping that will be taken into consideration, that whatever the recommendations the legislature enacts or directs you to do, that if you thought about how they will actually, what that implementation will actually look like for cities, and the timing and the layering impact with all of the other rulemaking that you have going on, or that's other decisions like the industrial land conversation that Peggy brought up, like how this all fits together, and because cities and counties are going to be feeling this on the ground all at once.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think part of the reason especially for knowing all of the work that jurisdictions are doing right now, I think that first point right there with an administrative rulemaking will be particularly important. So that way jurisdictions recognize, like, yes, we're required to do a bunch of work on this recently. So we have that credit in place. But I think one of the things that you're kind of pointing to is the need for a simple but detailed enough schedule. And we have the beginnings of that in the owner report that's going to be released later today. It's not fully finished, because it is kind of like jumping into double Dutch rope to, I guess, steal a analogy from Ted Reed. But the more that we can kind of communicate how the system is going to start up, I think the better. And that's really what we're trying to move to in the next couple of weeks when we get into communications mode. Well, and also statutory writing mode. There's a lot to do, but
Sean, I appreciate that. I just, this could be the best recommendation report and cities could agree with everything, but if it's not rolled out in a way that's implementable, or if it's stacked on top of so many other requirements, it's not going to be possible. And obviously funding has to be there as well.
Of course.
Kathy?
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, okay. The other thing I would ask that you add is not only housing diversity, efficiency, affordability, but I'd also ask that you put in accessibility.
So this is actually a really interesting question. We had this same discussion on the housing needs work group too, because one of the hard parts with accessibility is, and I think this fits in with goal 10, is the challenge that so many features of accessibility are related to building code. And we actually have like a lot of kind of recommended follow-up work to ensure that the building codes division is kind of steadily following up on accessibility there. And of course, there's other things that relate to that in land use. But then the challenge is when it comes to land use planning, right? And the things that you require at that point in the state, in that stage of the kind of development process, is that a lot of the features don't actually really connect that much to accessibility, but other features do. Like if you have, say walkable, bikeable infrastructure, you're much more easily able to get around if you have a disability, right? And that kind of coincides with a lot of these other broader planning things that go up. But I do think we should articulate that as like that's a goal or a part of the planning process just in general with goal 10 that we need to be taking into account and thinking about how we respond to that. That will be part of the statutory language. We can emphasize it in here. I just want to be also clear that we're not asking planners to require specific building features when that's the responsibility of the state. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you may, instead of saying accessibility, put in visitability, which is going to be a different level of requirement and may or may not be in the code. I know the Fair Housing Act amendments are pretty much already in the code, at least in the state code, as I understand it. So just raising the issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, yeah, you're right. It should be articulated as a value.
Thanks, Kathy. Brian, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Support the recommendation. My suggestion is to allow it to still be coupled, efficiency measures coupled with the UGB. Don't make it, I don't think it's necessarily serving a community to make it mandatory to do it as part of the housing production strategy. So just give it as an option is my suggestion. Thank you.
It would be an option, right? Because there are cities that are below 10,000 that wouldn't, might not even be interested in a housing production strategy. So, right, this wouldn't actually put the efficiency measures in the housing production strategy statute. It would just clarify that you could implement housing efficiency measures as part of the housing production strategy. So it would just be an option.
Thanks, Brian. Heather, go ahead.
Okay, I think that actually just helped clarify, because one of the things, the way I was reading it and thinking about some of the discussion we've had earlier about trying to get away from what I call the bean counting, where it's like your math is like, what's your population projection? Do your efficiency measures. That impacts whether you need to expand, and if so, how much? So I thought we were trying to get a little bit away from that. And I was trying to understand if you did an initial check on efficiency measures that were housing production strategies, an initial estimate of how much additional housing you would get with those actions. And then you adopted your urban growth boundary. And then after that, you adopted your housing production strategies, which included your efficiency measure. And we have certainly seen some adjustments through the public adoption process from what we thought we were going to get to what we ended up getting with the final adoption package. So I was just trying to understand how that would play out if your final adoption is different than what you originally estimated, but you've already adopted your urban growth boundary. And so I'm not necessarily looking for an answer to that unless you've got one, but more just like as a refinement, it seems like that might be something, unless I missed it, that we might address in the rulemaking or down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we would need to think about this in the rulemaking, because I don't think there's like a super clear answer there. But and let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. The thing that you're kind of thinking about is, all right, well, once we do these efficiency measures, how then do we plug that back into the bean counting, right? Now that we have this kind of additional capacity that's online, and then how does that sequence with the UGB amendment itself? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, when we've done it, we did the efficiency measures first, adopted them. We did an estimate, then we adopted them. Those ended up being two different numbers, what was estimated to what was adopted. And then based on that, we ended up not expanding our urban growth boundary. But it affected, you know, how much capacity obviously we had in the UGB. So when we were talking about marrying housing production strategies, which don't have to be done until a year after adoption of your UGB, I was trying to understand if you punt adoption of those efficiency measures to after UGB adoption, how does the math work? And maybe it doesn't matter, because I thought we were trying to get away from that tie to the math.
Yeah, I mean, I think that will definitely, I think there's going to need to be some thinking on that in rulemaking. I imagine, you know, I think and this is actually something that we express in a future recommendation, so we should actually move to that next set if we can. I know we're starting to run short on time. But when it comes to the actual count, that bean counting part of the equation, once we get back into it, we do want to avoid having very significant paper capacity, right? Lands that are hypothetically developable to XYZ capacity, but you know, maybe in practice they aren't. So tying that really into kind of past production trends, right? If you say, you know, upzoning it, basing that off of kind of realistic projections, or you know, in some cases using the 3% provision that's provided in statute directly, is going to continue to be an important part of that equation, because we don't want to count that capacity incorrectly, right? And have a shortage.
I'll maybe send you a specific example just for consideration.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, Peggy.
And Peggy, and you're going to be our last commenter on this particular one, and we'll move to the next one.
I got it. So I just, Heather's comments sort of made me think twice. You have adopted a schedule for the large cities and their discussions around land capacity, and then the HPS work. And what she's talking about is that schedule that I'm wondering is really going to be changed as a part of your HNA and this discussion. Make sense? Currently, you have a 6 or 8 year responsibility, these large cities have, and they have a specific schedule, and then they are to do their HPS afterwards. What I think I'm hearing from Heather is trying to figure out chicken, egg, all of that process. Are we looking at changing that?
Well, the chicken egg, I'm not sure. I apologize. I don't know how to answer your question. The sequencing is important. I can recognize that, but I'm not exactly sure what you mean in terms of the 6 to 8 year schedule and how that connects in.
Well, I think what Heather was saying was that she does her, after she does her 6 or 8 year VLI, then she has to do the HPS afterwards. But if she really wants to know what her capacity is, she really sort of needs to do the HPS with the efficiency measures beforehand.
I see. This is also getting to another core recommendation of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, which is breaking that sequencing. It's not going to be rigidly, you start with your housing capacity analysis, then you do your housing production strategy. It will be, you either do them together, or you could even start with your housing production strategy first. It depends, you know, really probably providing more of that flexibility on the sequencing to local governments and just having one deadline.
Right, that was what I was trying to get at. I wanted to make sure that was on the table because I listened to the RJNA.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's a core part. That'll continue to be a core part.
All right, well, let's go ahead and move to the next one, the regulatory review of UGB amendments. Sean, if you want to give us the couple minute overview.
Yeah, okay, so these really relate into kind of three discussions that we'd had previously. The first one being on the 20-year housing needs projection and having, what your needed housing is. The second two being in relationship to the buildable lands inventory, right? And that kind of discussion about paper capacity. So the first one on amending the needed housing statute, this is all about the implementation of the Oregon housing needs analysis, right? So rather than having, kind of these individualized 20-year localized housing needs projection, which, everybody needs to do a full-fledged analysis, that analytical burden is then shifted to the state. It plans for significantly more housing and provides to local jurisdictions numbers of needed housing units by income, as well as other information, including, say, like, cost burdening for various demographic groups and all these kind of different equity analysis indicators, that type of thing. So it really provides, shifts a lot of that analysis requirement to the state. But additionally, kind of recognizing that so many jurisdictions have been hampered in kind of just projecting out future housing need based on what the past trends are, kind of in following statute, and that not always aligning with housing needs, clarifying in statute that jurisdictions have more discretion to plan for future housing types and characteristics in a manner that's responsive to need and is market feasible, right? Rather than just based on past trends. So that's the first recommendation. The second one is, adjusting statute to kind of reflect a more realistic estimation of 20-year residential land supply. There's some specific kind of recommendations in the report that kind of highlight how you would do that, including, where you set the kind of 20-year threshold, which types of lands you include and don't include. And then finally, directing LCDC to kind of adopt administrative rules outlining a lot more revised methodological assumptions and safe harbors, right, for estimating the capacity of buildable lands, right, and to provide them a lot more kind of off-the-shelf safe harbors in terms of things like, partially vacant and redevelopment infill scenarios, the effect of rezoning, right, in relationship to efficiency measures, appropriate removal of kind of constrained and goal protected lands, right, like we've heard a lot with wetlands, and then of course market factor adjustments, recognizing that even when you do have this land supply, there are market factors that can inhibit its likelihood to develop, and that should be reflected in the analysis. So those are the three major recommendations there on the establishing need portion.
All right, raise your hands to get in the queue and do take another look at those questions that Arpana put on in the chat again, so they're right at the top of the chat. We're looking for any refinements to make one recommendation or a combination. Oh, there you go. There, Mary Kyle, go ahead.
On the big picture, this is fine. I have some serious concerns about some of the more detailed things that are written here. And again, this is where I'm not sure, is that left to another day of rulemaking and hammering it out or not, but I'll raise them here because I'm just not clear on that. There are several. First, well, it's page 5 in my packet, but under the buildable land statute, where you talk about enable the application of market factor amendments reflecting reduced likelihood of development or redevelopment in light of regulatory or market constraints. That has a lot of words in it that are potentially problematic. Market factor, I mean, the housing market's usually looking 2 to 3 years out. We're talking about 20-year urban growth boundaries. So I'm not sure how or why one would calculate that. And then regulatory constraints are often things that are barriers that should be removed, as opposed to taking them into account and therefore discounting the buildability of the land. And I don't mean environmental regulations, but I mean off-street parking or something like that, that can just be a barrier that reduces the ability to develop a given piece of land. So regulatory barriers are, made by us. Market constraints, again, those are cyclical, and this is a longer range planning exercise. So I have concerns about that. And then a little further down the page, it goes again into some more market factor issues of parcelization, infill, and redevelopment. I think local governments have been dealing with those for as long as they've been dealing with assessing the urban growth boundaries in terms of how in their area it makes sense to deal with those factors in assessing redevelopment potential. But I have, my organization has severe opposition to taking into account private covenants and restrictions on buildable land. Those are private contracts between a landowner and a homeowners association or developer. And the agency, DLCD, has gone through a long discussion about this when you did the streamlined UGB discussion and decided not to take it into account correctly, I think. These are not reflective of public policy. They are private contracts and should not be built into our land use planning system. So we are definitely opposed to taking that into account. And then there's just a few other things about, constrained lands and gold protected lands, are they actually zoned for development or not? How do you take into account second homes since those things change hands? I mean, those are just things that could be worked out in a more detailed rulemaking. They're just things that would take more discussion, but those are a few of the ones here that, the ones I mentioned, I don't know when we might be discussing these in more detail.
No, I understand that. Yeah, and any like specifics, right, would need to be clarified in administrative rule or be provided through like some type of quantifiable validation, right? It's similar to the efficiency measures, but I think the point there is just to articulate, right? We've seen a lot of scenarios, right? I've seen, even in just the short couple of years that I've been here, just a variety of examples of, folks showing me a parcel and saying, hey, this entire thing counts as buildable. All of these lots count as buildable, but the reality is that redevelopment is very unlikely to occur. So there are ways that we could take that into account, or there are methodological safe harbors that we could use to do that. And we don't really have much to kind of reflect that, especially like when they're just.
Yeah, that's worthwhile. There are certain things I would not want to see included in that. And I've met some of the main ones here.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Mary Kyle. Peggy, go ahead.
So on this one, I just have a question about market factors. As I concern myself with the 50% of current units that really are publicly subsidized. And so how do you consider market when we know that half of these units really need to be publicly subsidized, and yet we don't know where that money is coming from or if it comes?
It might just be that it's maybe a jargony term. It's all it's intended to do. This is something that the state of Washington employs, and they do a much more blanket type approach where they just articulate like a number that is kind of arbitrary. But the point is being that, even when you have the zoning in place, when you have the land in place, there are factors that can inhibit the developability of a parcel over 20 years, right? And that could be for either market rate housing or for subsidized affordable housing. It's not intended to specify that. It's just saying, is there a way that we could take that dynamic into account? Is really the intent.
Got it. I just really want to make sure that we remember and that everybody understands that point as well as me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peggy. There's no one's dumb here. All good questions. Garrett?
Well, I think I will say Mary Kyle is very intelligent. So I think a lot of the words that I was going to say and feelings about this, she articulated. So kind of just double stamp, underline what's there. Really love the intent of this to take into the past underproduction and having a less burden on local government. So thumbs up, that's our intent. We're going to be moving it. So maybe it's some of these details and decipherment. The one piece on the market factors, I would support Mary Kyle, and I see in our packet, we have kind of letters. I just had it up here, but we define, you put some bullet points there, A through D, on what market factors you're looking at. I don't think we would support the the including codes or local covenants or restrictions piece of it there in that. And then would like to get some thoughts on, you make mention of, we're trying to capture past underproduction, but that it's not called out in here or defined as much as far as some of the others are. So is that happening somewhere else, Sean, or how do you think that's something we should add into this here?
It's actually implicit in the recommendations of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. So by implementing an Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, we would have a methodology that accounts for underproduction. It would account for underproduction housing for people experiencing homelessness. And it would, also account for like the fact that there are varying kind of economic characteristics between cities, and that can reinforce dynamics, right? And a lack of responsibility in some versus others. And I lost my train of thought, but essentially if you implement that analysis, pretty much every jurisdiction is going to be planning for significantly more housing than they are today, especially at lower incomes, because that's where the current methodology really has a tendency to underestimate the actual need.
Yeah, and the methodology for that past underproduction, that's something we are or aren't looking at, or where's that happening?
It happens at the state.
Okay, but has it already happened, or is that methodology still being formed?
So the pilot methodology is developed. What we were tasked with is on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is to deliver recommendations on how you would implement that to state and local planning programs. So how would you set up the administrative structure? Who does the analysis, right? How often do they revise the methodology, right? And how does that play out? That is detailed in the report that's coming up today.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, Heather.
A quick question. So you mentioned the market factor, and that Washington actually puts a number in their rules. So this is my not as familiar with the legislative process, but if we actually put that in the OARs, how would we ensure that that would keep up with changes in market conditions? So I just, I'm sure you guys are already thinking about that, but I'd be curious to know how Washington deals with that. And then the other thing I was going to say, not to bring up CC&Rs again, but I know that has certainly been a hot topic in Eugene over the years with our BLI, and the difficulty and the amount of resources to do the research is really challenging. And so I just mentioned that because if it was an option in there, there would probably be a push to include that, which would be pretty challenging. We have looked at it certainly because it gets brought up a lot. So I can just appreciate the comments that I've already heard about CC&Rs. Of course, I also appreciate not wanting to have phantom capacity when you have CC&Rs that are restricting the property. So it's just a challenge, but it just seems pretty difficult. So anyway, you don't have to comment on that, but I am curious about the market factor.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point. We wouldn't want to introduce anything that puts a jurisdiction in a position where they have to do a bunch more analysis that's like, difficult and expensive. So that is actually a pretty good point there. So we would either want to make sure that these are very straightforward and don't require it like significant analysis, or don't include that just for recognition of the challenge that you would face in actually doing that. In Washington specifically, it's just a flat number. It's not based in analysis. It's specified in statute.
And do they update it? Like,
No.
do they go in and amend? No. Fascinating. Okay, thanks.
Jonathan?
Thanks. Is it in the other track, the housing needs analysis track, the one that we're not in? Is there any discussion in that track about what happens if a jurisdiction consistently fails to actually move the needle in terms of housing production at various income levels?
Yeah, so that was actually one of the biggest topics that was discussed in that work group. That was the whole point of like in the implementation of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, that informed kind of two major recommendations. The first one being, well, obviously, other than implementing this for the purpose of a housing needs projection, actually starting to track, like articulate goals and start tracking outcomes, right? To see how we're doing, what progress are we making, right? And how are we doing in meeting these kind of different, production targets that we have? How are we doing on these different equity indicators, that type of thing, that are used to inform future policies? And then the second one is really refocusing, on the housing production strategy and really focusing on that as kind of the central document, implementing document of Goal 10. And the basis for kind of accountability is intrinsic to that document. So like the responsibility, right, is that you're acting to address a need. And then if you aren't doing that, there's kind of an enforcement tree. Starts up collaboratively, right, recognizing that our local partners often just need assistance and help. Then it progresses all the way up to an enforcement order at the most enforcement level tool. Does that answer your question? Okay. But the point is that the accountability there is based on action. The point of tracking outcomes is so that way we can get a really good idea of like, how are we doing on different things, other areas where we need to focus. Yeah, Mary Kyle?
I just want to be really clear because I'm not sure it was coming across clearly enough based on something you said, Sean, about the CC&R things. I think it's a policy matter. It's not a matter, it is a matter of practicality. I have heard Eugene explain before how challenging this is. And I learned a lot from that. But as a policy matter, I think the department should drop this from your recommendation. CC&Rs are exclusionary actions to preclude development of more diverse and affordable housing. And they should not be part of the agencies. They should not be in here anywhere. And I can imagine seeing dormant CC&Rs be brought back to life and revitalized by neighborhoods that do not want to see infill and other diverse housing types. A lot are dormant now in a lot of older cities, and they could be brought back to life. And I can't imagine what a headache that, I've heard the descriptions of what a headache that is for a lot of cities, but it's bad policy. I don't think it should be in here. So I just want to be really clear about that.
Understood.
Thanks, Mary. Mary Kyle. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, so looking at that first one with the housing needs statute, so the housing allocations would be the number of units basically that the ONA is putting out, right?
Number and incomes.
Number and incomes. And then when you're looking at type and characteristics responsive to need and market feasibility, I think we just need to be extremely careful about what we consider to be the need. Right now, I'm looking at the February 15th post from Josh Lerner on the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis blog. He has a great graph, right? It shows, what renters can afford versus the actual number of rental units there. If you look at the far right side, you see in that $2,500 a month column, there it shows there's a shortage of 80,000 units. Realistically, those people should be able to be homeowners. So it's not necessarily meaning that we need to build 80,000 more rentals. It might just mean that we need to build more housing that those people in that grouping can afford to purchase and take them out of the rental market to free up more space for other people that would need those. I just want to make sure that this doesn't get, pigeonholed just to largely to rentals, because that home ownership is really important.
And it's an articulated goal in the housing production strategy, right? That like home ownership is something that we want to encourage. And so really what this is recognizing is that this is a policy choice, right? And we're trying to provide options that are responsive to our residents' needs, but they also have to be grounded in, right, what people can afford and market feasibility, right? But it is a policy decision. So that's really the intent of what that's clarifying. And actually, if I could make the case even more so, right now, if they were to identify that they had renters, right, in that particular circumstance, they would actually be kind of required to plan for, whatever the existing mix of housing is now, even if the goal was to get more folks into homeownership.
Thanks, Brock. Brian, go ahead.
There we go. Thank you. So my comment is on the third one there and the ability to respond to local market conditions. And then in the context of what might make it a little more effective and politically viable. I was thinking of if there's the ability to include factors for rural and particularly border cities, like Ontario or Vail. I know there's cases where right now that they've lost development opportunities literally just a few miles down the road, so to speak, because Idaho can offer a development ability to be done in 40% of the time that it would take our guys to do it in Oregon, and maybe at a 30%, 40% less cost. So there's a big pricing point. So then we end up potentially losing 10, 20, 30 people in a given spot that could be Oregon residents, could be land provided for housing, that they're kind of getting pushed across the border. So definitely not a main issue, obviously, for the majority of our communities throughout the state. But I know I was just at an unrelated meeting hearing a couple of the senators talk, state senators talk about some of the land use issues out here. And that would be a big, I think, a big accelerator to helping this be more effective and politically viable, is to within that being able to respond to local market. And again, I don't know exactly the details of how to include. I know there's plenty of examples, and we could probably get to a couple, 2 or 3 significant points that could help. But within that ability to respond, a local community responding to local market conditions, having it specifically be if they're dealing with a competitive advantage that another state has.
So here's a question that I have, because, right, this is all about the bean counting, right? And sometimes this bean counting is lawsuit fuel. We don't want to add lawsuit fuel. That's actually like one of the main reasons like why we might actually want to avoid including some of these metrics, so that way we don't promote kind of analyses that end up in court. And that sounds like one of them. But like, here's the, like, when I'm thinking about, like, say, you know, Ontario, right? We could make the adjustment in the math for the BLI, and sure, maybe they get a couple more housing units as a consequence of that. But don't you think, like, wouldn't they really just want like faster permitting times, like less costs for the development of housing, to like actually get those housing units built in Oregon, right? Like that's, you know, I know Dan Cummings, like I'm sure he would prefer that, right? So
Right.
what, rather than adjusting the math, why don't we, you know, really gear the housing production strategy? And we do this in the recommendations, like saying the goal here is to really reduce the cost of development, streamline, you know, any kind of regulatory barriers and processes, put the state in partnership with the right types of investments to get development happening, and like actually try to get housing built on the ground, right? Do you think that would be, yeah?
I think it would be. I think ideally it'd be great if they had the opportunity to, if there were triggers that were met where they could potentially make a case for either, or like where they'd have an option to either kind of go with the numbers like that, like, or I mean, the processes like that. But it's really kind of wonky sometimes. I mean, you just get, it's not a big deal to 97% of the state, but for the 3% that has some issue, I mean, it can be a really a big setback, and it can be a holdback. So I would agree with your comment. I would say though that it would be great if they could still have some ability in there where if a case came up and it had the numbers, that they could substantiate and say, hey,
well,
so that would be the point there though. But
the good news too is that that also comes into play in the Oregon housing needs analysis, right? So like right now, jurisdictions are locked into housing need based only on their population projections. And so that means if you're, say, losing households to Idaho, or you might be even, you know, not growing, you could have a negative housing needs projection, right? Or a very small one that's reduced. This actually stops that from happening, because everybody receives a share based in part on their population growth, but also in part on like regional job share. So nobody would have a 0 or negative housing share under this type of system. And it would kind of reflect the fact that actually, you know, we see like that there is growth in this region that's happening. Sure, you know, maybe some of that spills over the border, but the reality is like Ontario is not going to have a lower projection of housing, of needed housing units as a consequence.
yeah, no, that sounds great.
Okay, Peggy, once again, you are our last person to comment on this one. So,
Sorry, I just really want to respond to Brian's comment. Because I think it's really important for people to hear. The Ontario area has lots of UGB. What they don't have is serviced buildable lots. And the other issue between Ontario and the Boise area are large lots versus urban lots. So I just want to make sure that people understand that the story that we hear about what's happening with Ontario is broader than just they're building over there and not over here.
And I also, you know, for what it's worth, like, yeah, I think the way we want to set up the recommendations and just broader support at the state is like, we should get that land like ready for development. We should be providing it with the public services needed to get it ready for housing production.
okay, Sean, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one. We've got 2 more to walk through. We're doing good with our timing of 20 to 25 minutes for each one. So this one's a little more complicated. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just note too that, you know, this one is a little bit more complicated. This is where we get into the regulatory review of UGB adjustments, which I recognize can be contentious, right? So if we need to, the 4th item, which is about like, let's have more funding and resources for local jurisdictions, I recognize it's probably a little bit less controversial. We can spend a little bit more time here if we need to. I just wanted to offer that up. But just to talk through this, right, these were a lot of the recommendations that we talked about in the last meeting. The one it doesn't include is the funding, which is in the next section. But the first one is on the actual urban reserve statute. So the basic idea here is providing jurisdictions a lot more flexibility by making some kind of strategic tweaks and adjustments to statute and administrative rule to kind of facilitate it as an option. And of course, as we'll talk about later, to actually fund and enable cities to get direct support from DLCD to do that. And so that is something that once they have that in place, that really simplifies the actual Goal 14 analysis process, and makes it, you know, really changes it in the cases that I've heard from a years-long process to a couple months. The second one being kind of providing more options to utilize the UGB land swap process to increase its flexibility and enable its utilization, especially if a jurisdiction is, say, doing a housing capacity analysis and they, you know, might not be eligible for an expansion, but they see that they have this land that's been kind of sitting there for a while and it's not really kind of developable, to give them some more options to kind of promote housing development. The third one being on the streamlined urban growth boundary adjustment process. So in exchange for kind of delivering a statewide housing policy goal, there's kind of a you know, more streamlined process, though there would probably need to be some safeguards around that, that you know, kind of enable that small scale expansion to occur. And, you know, in the recommendations, we talk about kind of basing that off of some existing statute that we have, House Bill 4079, the Affordable Housing Pilot Project. And then the last one, so we had talked about this maybe more as a concept in the last meeting, but I think what we took away from, or at least what I took away from that conversation, was the, you know, what we should be reducing kind of the basis and incentive for appeal, but we don't want to, you know, really what that should be is something more like a kind of clear and objective track. And when we look at the simplified UGB methodology and how that kind of plays out, is it doesn't provide that kind of simplification or that certainty to jurisdictions, and making some amendments there to provide that certainty and kind of reducing the kind of discretion in that process could make that a pathway that is viable, and of course has incentives because it's much less likely to be appealed. So that is kind of how that recommendation is taken fold. So those are the 4 major recommendations. Let's take a step back.
All right. I'm going to put the questions back in the queue, or in the chat rather. Heather, go ahead.
So a couple questions. When I just read the first one about urban reserves to increase flexibility and ease implementation, I could read that to mean including some of the cleanup of some of the language so that there's potentially more similarities where appropriate between UGB language and urban reserves language. So I didn't see anything about that. And I know we brought that up quite a bit. So I'm curious if there had been any conversation about that, because I didn't see that in the memo. And the other thing that we brought up was the ability to do rural reserves as a complementary component to urban reserves, which I believe are not allowed yet outside of the Portland metro area, which would be really helpful and I would think would show a balance of the concept. So anyway, I was just curious if either of those two things have been specifically left out of the conversation.
No, it wasn't intentional. We'll
Okay.
Take another look at that and incorporate that into how we think about this. But those are some good suggestions.
And Heather, can you say again what the first one was? Just, you went through them a little quick. I want to make sure we got it.
Sorry, of course, the mail carrier showed up right at that moment. So the first,
I got the rural reserves one, but I missed the first one.
yeah, is just about being able to sync up the terminology or some of the requirements between UGB planning and urban reserves planning.
Okay, thanks. All right, other folks? Questions, comments, viability, refinements? Garrett, go ahead.
Yeah, and I like a few people talking because they're really intelligent folks. So Heather, I agree with her points on the rural reserves. I live in the Portland metro area, so I really think that has benefited the process and how we go through that. And I'm all for the faster process to get that, especially that initial step of urban reserve and concept planning. I wonder if there's for the appeal process. I agree there. And so I wonder if there are more objective measures we could set up or provide policy direction on what appeals would have to be necessarily based for or grounds for appeal. And so I know I don't have language now, but that's something I could send to you, Sean, after the meeting. And then I did when I was used to work in Virginia, and we had a transfer of development rights system, which is similar to kind of, I think, how we're conceptually setting up this UGB swap. And so I think that's something that works really well. And especially in kind of quickly urbanizing areas where you want to kind of reinforce kind of your town center, your more central development. So anything we can do to get that more kind of statutorily in place, it's really helpful, because I saw in Virginia that was actually pretty favorable on the private development side, to be able to really kind of have the public sector, have the government set up the rules for it, and then they really were able to kind of take it and run with it. And we had a couple of successful projects. So yeah, let's start moving towards that. I think that'll be helpful, Sean.
All right. Yeah, no, thank you. I'd be interested to see what the language.
Thanks, Garrett. Annalise?
Yeah, I'm curious, the affordable housing pilot project, my understanding is that has never applied to the metro area. Are you anticipating that this would now apply to us, or is that not part of your adjusting statute?
That wasn't the intent. Really, I think what I would imagine this would be intended for are especially those jurisdictions that, they might have like projects and investors lined up. I think we've seen a few examples in different cities around the state, and they might be smaller, right? They lack kind of the capacity to do significant Goal 14 analysis. And it might be worthwhile to see, hey, if you are willing to deliver, a minimum of these types of, housing options that align with state goals, do we have options to kind of make that flexible and to reduce the regulatory burden to help you be able to reach that point. I really see this being kind of an option for especially small cities who want that flexibility.
Thank you.
Thanks, Annalise. Mary Kyle?
Thank you. I have seen urban reserves and rural reserves work well, and the metro area isn't the only place. The Rogue Valley collectively went through a different process and established urban reserves. I don't remember if they've designated rural reserves or not, but it's also happening fluidly there. So if this is, or UGB expansions are happening pretty fluidly there. If this is something that goes forward, both of those are examples of a regional approach to urban reserves and doing other planning along with it. Like, you know, infrastructure was very useful. So that might be something there. On the
Is
land.
Is that more like an encourage, like if you have a regional organization that wants to do urban reserve planning, just like encouraging it through funding, that type of thing?
I don't know. I think that's the that would be for later rulemaking. I think you'd want to hear from Metro and the Rogue Valley about what worked and if there are any other regions interested in that. I just realized that those were multi-government things and they managed to, you know, help it make it work. And do other planning. It wasn't just this land thing. They, you know, it was more comprehensive than that. On the land swaps, it's not clear to me exactly how this would work, but maybe the logistics of it, we don't have to know yet, but there's a line here on page 7 that says land removed for a UGB would keep its applicable zone and land use regulations. I don't understand that. So, because if it's out of a UGB, I would think it would go back into a resource zone, not keep if it had a development zone. I don't know. So that just confuses me. But anyway, just the logistics of that, of how the land swap would work. I'm fine with the idea.
Actually,
And Mary Kyle, before you move on, where is that again?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Where is the land swap piece you're talking about?
Oh, page 7.
7.
Yeah, it says something about where applicable zone and land use regulations do not change. It was on the measure 49 potential hurdle to doing land swap. But anyway,
there it is.
It seems to me not quite be a swap if you're not changing the zone, but in any event, I think that can be worked out later. On the issue, we talked last time about, you know, a streamlined UGB process and maybe something for smaller UGBs. I don't recall a proposal until I read it here, maybe I missed it, to take the House Bill 4079 concept and make it applicable statewide. And we would oppose that. That was supposed to be a pilot project and to be a proof of concept to see what are the factors that go into producing affordable housing on land, or to producing affordable housing. Is it just land, or is it a lot of other things too? Regulations, infrastructure, proximity to other things. And as we've seen by the 3 cities that have been approved to use this process, they're not very far along, even though one has free publicly owned land, which might, that's Redmond. I think it'll probably be coming along, but this was what, 2015 statute. The point of all that was a proof of concept, and DLCD issues reports maybe every biennium or annually to report on all of the factors that go into producing affordable housing. And I see the goals here listed for the affordable housing that could potentially be produced in a UGB expansion, but it's the whole point of 4079 was to illustrate, is it just land or is it more? And it's more. And if it is more, what is it? What is the full set of tools that we need to come together to produce affordable housing? And if we need all those other tools like infrastructure funding, should we be putting that inside our existing urban growth boundaries where land also needs infrastructure funding? So this is something to us, this is a bait and switch on 4079 to take it and goes statewide with it. But other, you know, a smaller UGB, making it easier to do a smaller UGB expansion, and streamlining the simplified, or taking another look at streamlining the simplified UGB methodology, that's fine.
Okay.
But if we're trying to get affordable housing, I'm not sure if leading with a UGB expansion is the way to go, as opposed to leading with affordable housing and what does it need to, what do we need to build affordable housing, and then, you know, the location. is, you know, is part of that.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's kind of two follow-up questions I have in here. One is kind of for the group, and then one is, you know, just something to percolate on. The first one being, all right, we want to know, like, we recognize this is like one of the more controversial kind of recommendations that's included in the report. That's okay. I would want to know people's thoughts on it. The second piece is one of the things that we have to think about, and is kind of the third question, is what is the alternative that delivers in the legislative direction? And what I'm thinking of specifically is, you know, when you have, say, especially a smaller jurisdiction, right? That's in my view, probably one of the more important case scenarios that I could think of. And they, would be otherwise like kind of boxed in due to kind of the hurdles associated with the Goal 14 analysis, and it's, very, very onerous to come through. Like, what's the alternative that we could offer to say, like, this is going to be a streamlined process, especially if you can offer something like, right, subsidized affordable housing, middle housing option, like all these different kind of statewide policy goals that we're striving for. That's kind of the question that I have.
It is what 4079 is. It lets you go around most of the land use laws to bring in up to 50 acres of land if a relatively small percentage of it is available for affordable housing. The ones that you have here are even more ambitious, and yet we haven't been able to do even the less ambitious 4079. And again, that was supposed, the 4079 was, as one legislator said, I'm gonna, it's a proof of concept. Let's see what it is that it takes to do affordable, to really locate well affordable housing. And the DLCD reports are supposed to be, parsing through the three: Pendleton, Redmond, and Bend. Not, Pendleton's a smaller city, but these aren't really smaller unstaffed jurisdictions. And it's not happening as fast as people had hoped. And for example, is infrastructure the issue? And if it is, shouldn't that drive the discussion? Does a city need infrastructure? And inside its existing urban growth boundary, it should be the first question. Because an expansion, it shouldn't be an easy way to get infrastructure to a place where it isn't as needed as it is inside an urban growth boundary. So it just seems like there's a I don't know, whatever, cart leading the horse, or whatever that metaphor is. It doesn't seem to be a very analytical way to go about meeting the needs of housing and cities that don't have the maybe staffing. I think you could do the staffing, as you said, through another one of these. Maybe it's the last thing about technical support from DLCD to do a Goal 14 analysis, and that might show that infrastructure is what's needed in the city to develop affordable housing. Might or might not be more land.
And and for what it's worth too, like we're also, like, in the core recommendations, we're kind of saying that specific piece, right, on all of the other factors that are needed for development are really the core of, like, what we need to start doing at the state level. So that is definitely part of the recommendations. But I don't want to take up the time with
my alternative is provide technical assistance to do the full, it's a proof of concept that hasn't proved itself yet. So I don't know why it would be in this recommendation.
Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, Brian. And Brian also put a note in the chat that's worth reading.
So confirmed by our chief operating officer and our affordable housing director, the master plan for the 4079 property in Bend is moving forward. They're about to submit 108 affordable deed restricted housing units. So Mary Kyle, I know you can't be up to speed on all the things that are happening that you don't see, but in Bend, the 4079 project was, I would say, very successful. I think the challenge there was the financing on the first, there's a financing challenge, even with land that is not priced nearly as high as urban land. There's still a difficult, a difficult hurdle to get over, especially when a developer was initially trying to actually pull this off without massive subsidies, to try to pull this project off at a market rate, to do this through the market mechanisms. So I think that took some time. They ended up selling the property. It's gone through a couple of hands. So now it's moving forward. And I just wanted the group to know. And also that I think the Bend staff And city council would actually really strongly support this kind of recommendation. I can't speak for the city council, but based on their involvement in other projects that have a similar theme of expand the UGB, get a certain amount of deed restricted affordable housing, and we know we have a guaranteed amount through that process, and it's worked for Ben. So I just want to provide that clarification.
And I did know that, Brian, but it's when it passed in 2015, there was this thought that it would be a quick delivery of affordable housing, and it's been 7 years, which I think is not an odd period of time, but it wasn't as quick as those pushing the legislation thought it would be. But I think your description of the things that Bend had to go through as a deed restricted, it's gone through a couple sales, the financing, those are all the things that are supposed to be analyzed in DLCD's reports to show what did we need to deliver affordable housing, and what are all the parts of those tools, and is land the primary thing, or is it other things too? And so how do we deliver those if we're going to be delivering affordable housing into cities? That 50 acres isn't necessarily the panacea everywhere.
Thanks, Brian and Mary Kyle. Samantha, I see your hand up.
Sure, and sorry, I'm having some tech issues today, so I'm not able to come off camera, but I think what we know is that it is land and it is other issues. And sometimes being able to find land that is actually workable, developable, and affordable, so that you are able to bring an affordable housing project to market and make that a reality is a challenge. And so I appreciate this entire section and where this is heading to try and find a way to do an expedited process if we're able, for affordable housing, for workforce housing, and housing that we know our communities desperately need right now, and they really can't wait 7 years for. So I appreciate the general direction that this section is taking, and am supportive of the state looking at ways to find an expedited process that's going to work statewide.
Thank you, Samantha. Gordon.
I just want to make a quick clarification to Annalise. I believe it is an open question whether this concept about the 50-acre potential would apply to Metro or not. So I wanted to make sure that it wasn't clarified that it definitely wouldn't apply. I mean, it's obviously whatever happened would be a final decision of the legislature, but and also obviously there would be some issues about how it would apply for Metro versus an individual city. But I just want to clarify that it's certainly not impossible that it would apply to Metro. It might. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you, Gordon. I appreciate that clarification.
Thanks, Gordon. Sean, how do you feel about moving on to our last one with our last 20 minutes?
So I feel like we have hit, actually, I do want to air this out a little bit more because I don't think we actually need the full 20 minutes for the next item. We should move to it soon. But I think we're at that stage now. So I think a lot of these pieces that we've talked about are, relatively reasonable refinements. But now with this one policy, right, we've hit that place where I have seen people dig their heels in the sand on either side, right? And they're staking out their positions. And you know what that means? That means any meaningful action is going to be impossible. So what I need to figure out, and this is something I need from you all, what is going to be an acceptable alternative, right? And I'm trying, my brain's racking, I'm trying to think like what would be necessary, what would be, responsive to the need that we're trying to address here. And I'm coming up blank, right? And I don't think that's that's not a good outcome. So that's what I want you guys to all to think about that. We're not going to resolve that. We have, 25 minutes, right? But just keep that in mind, right? All right. So Dave, please.
Hey, Sean, real quick. I just want to clarify what you were commenting, because there were a lot of things in this one policy piece. So I think that was kind of hard to work through. So help us. What is the specific part though? Is it the affordable housing pilot piece? Where do you see the impasse at?
Oh, the impasse at the affordable housing pilot project,
okay.
Specifically the small scale UGB adjustment. This is where I'm noticing, right? that they're staking positions.
Am I on, Sean?
Yes.
Yep, you are.
All right, we'd be very supportive of changes to either the statute or the rule that would provide and factor in infrastructure costs as well as land costs into housing determinations. In fact, if we did that and we figured out where it would be the cheapest to run both infrastructure and purchase land, I think we might be able to build the housing that the housing needs analysis would show is necessary.
Understood. Thank you. Yeah, Peggy.
So because there may be an impasse with the House Bill 4079 does not mean that we don't have a whole ton of new ideas that are being considered, including what's going to be happening with the regional housing needs analysis work and the new targets and all of those kinds of things. So I would hope that if you are listening to one area where we have concerns about the placement of affordable housing on the edge instead of where it belongs, and a number of those factors with 4079 and the fact that it was a pilot that hasn't really gotten off the ground. I am thrilled, Brian, that perhaps it's going to finally happen in Bend. The last time I heard the report, it had not happened because it had changed hands a number of times. But I guess I would not think, Sean, that you would be disappointed with all of the other work that is happening around this without having one small section of a very big change in our land use system.
Thanks, Peggy. Marika?
I agree with Peggy. I think there's quite a lot here and a lot that is really changing. Leading with the housing production strategies is really great and it's new. And I think you've heard a lot of support for it. I think there's a lot of great stuff here. And because we do not want to see a pilot project that has not fully proven out yet, nor have we digested the analysis of what worked, what didn't work, what were the barriers, why did it take 7 years, from one place and other places. It has not been digested. And I don't think it's consistent with that legislation to pop it up here like this. So, but I think there's a lot of great stuff here. And I think the technical support that the state can provide to those smaller cities to address housing and affordable housing and a UGB expansion, if that's what is part of it, is huge. And just because I know Marianne only just got back on from the Farm Bureau, so I'll just say to Dave's remark about, we know the least expensive land to run infrastructure is always flat farmland. So I'm just going to push back on that one. But and I think Marianne's back on the call. So but in any event, I think there's great stuff here. And I think you should consider it a success, Sean, even if it doesn't have this part in it, or this is a contentious part. I think you can get at it through a more comprehensive assistance to a city, not just on a go around some of the land use laws and get a 50-acre pop out, but instead do a comprehensive technical assistance to a city on their overall housing and infrastructure needs.
Yeah, no, thank you. All right. Well, and just to be sensitive to time, Jamie, should we move on to the fourth category?
Yeah, I think that I don't see any other hands. I think people have said what they want to say about it. So appreciate you giving the extra time. The last option is the technical. You want to go ahead and go to the next slide?
Yeah, this one is, so building capacity, especially in small cities. So this is the one that is, money, of course, is going to be necessary to help jurisdictions, do the necessary planning work. We actually don't really provide currently significant planning dollars for actually performing Goal 14 related work, right? And we do have an agency request budget in for a baseline budget just in relationship to housing for $2.5 million, right? Obviously, some of that could be leveraged for this work, but one of the things that we point out in this, in the draft recommendations is a lot of these processes are much more expensive than, say, a housing capacity analysis or housing production strategy, especially when you're looking at public facilities plans. Those can really cost a lot of money. And so the reality is that if this is going to make a meaningful dent, $2.5 million is not enough. And so the other things that we're doing are some more programmatic changes, really, especially for those smaller jurisdictions, especially those with very limited staff capacity, having some type of programs in place, likely in partnership with councils of government, to help jurisdictions with very limited staff capacity, so that way they don't have to submit a grant application to us, right? That's especially important for those really small cities with, say, like one admin person on staff, that kind of thing. And the other piece of this is, as part of that agency request budget, we have 3 planning positions that are requested for that. We actually make the case that maybe we should actually have 4. And their whole point should be to be doing more Goal 14 and housing related work. They would be part of kind of a core housing production team here at DLCD. Their job, in addition to helping local governments get through the Goal 14 process, and even in some cases maybe do Goal 14 analyses, is to really help and prepare land for development. And so that is kind of the role that they would take on, and to be able to provide that expertise and guidance to local jurisdictions. So that's the core of these 2 recommendations on funding and building capacity in jurisdictions. Let's take a step back.
Yeah, so hands up for folks who have things they would like to share about this one. I'm just looking at the chat. Go ahead, Bill.
I guess my only question, I think this is great. I think it's essential. I think it's the only way really to go forward for smaller communities, especially. But my question is what we're talking about here enough? Given the crushing need for housing, and really some of the hurdles for the jurisdictions to get processes through, is this really going to be enough to move the needle, or do we need to be going bigger, faster?
And here's actually, Bill, I appreciate that comment, but this is a very small slice of the overall funding pie. This is just in specific to like Goal 14 planning, UGB expansions. What we note in the report, which again should be coming out before the end of today, is it does need to be much bigger, right? Like we don't actually fund at the LCD. We don't have funding for the types of things that are needed to get housing produced, things like infrastructure investments, things like site preparation, right? All those SDC deferrals or that type of thing. And we need to start doing that. And those recommendations really start outlining, hey, this need is going to be very significant. It's going to require dedicated and sustainable funding. There are also some places that we can start too, right? Like there are a lot of investments that a lot of different agencies are making in infrastructure right now as a consequence that have just received a bunch of additional funding from the feds that we can start leveraging, right? So we should definitely be following up on that, but just really noting that this need is much greater than $2.5 million, or even a little bit more than that for Goal 14 planning. So just wanted to be sensitive to that, but we are thinking about that more broadly in the recommendations.
Thanks, Sean. Garrett, go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to voice my support for this as a former planning director in a small town, and just seeing, like you're talking about the emphasis of trying for the state to bear more of this weight and be that partner. This is essential. And then, I really like the work that you're doing, Sean and Ethan and Kevin and the crew. So if you can get some more friends around the office, that'd be great to help move this through. I guess my only comment would be just helping out, with funding requests. There's also always the question of just kind of political viability. So I think tying this request, I didn't see it as much there, to maybe some of the outcomes we'd be looking towards, I think would be helpful in making this pitch. I think we have it kind of conceptually there, but I think you can tighten up some of the outcomes that we're really trying to drive towards, and why this additional funding, whether it's 2.5 million or even more as part of a bigger package, like you're saying, is really necessary at this time. So best of luck to you, Sean.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it's going to be hard to communicate, right? Because we can communicate the number of projects, but that doesn't tell you how much impact it has. But I'll give that some thought. Thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead, Michael. Thanks, Garrett.
Just wanted to voice our support for this recommendation. It really looks like it's unclear like whether it's at the scale that's really needed, but it is obviously a huge step in the right direction. And we can, if we can get this, it would be make a huge difference, and we can calibrate whether we might need more of this as it gets kind of started in implementation.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Kathy, go ahead.
Two things. First, I absolutely support more money, but I would also hope that you would be able to figure out who you can hook up, particularly on affordable or low income housing, how you can hook up a jurisdiction with the people who have some expertise in pulling it off. There was a big piece in the last few weeks on the guy who is doing the equivalent of mobile homes, is making small mobile homes and is building parks, and he is doing it, I think it's under $100,000, and he's saying that the private market won't do it, but that he knows how to make it work. And according to one of the people at HLB, he's actually very well known and people think highly of him. I'm forgetting his name. Andre knows it. And the other thing is, I should have said it, I don't have the full document with me. I didn't print it out, but back on the last one, there was discussion about the kinds of housing we were prioritizing. And one of the things I noticed was that there was nothing lower than 60% AMI, and we've got to get down to 0 to 30 AMI, and it should have been listed.
I apologize. No, that is, so you're specifically referring to the small scale UGB adjustment?
Yes.
Yeah, so that is a provision that was outlined in House Bill 4079, and then the additional pieces were just responding to, actually one of them was for households below 60% AMI, but then the other one was responding to another legislative kind of priority, that workforce housing that's affordable to people at or below median. The full-on scope of the recommendations, especially when you get to the funding section, are very emphasizing, yes, this includes a very significant amount of support needed for people between 0 and 60% AMI. But of course, there's also this other segment of the market that isn't really delivered by the market itself and would likely need some support to make happen in that 60 to 100% range. So yes, and it's kind of a yes and approach. To be clear, it's not saying, yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, but also liaison, making sure that there's a connection made between the people who know how to deal with the 0 to 30%, and the people who are the planners all over the state who don't have a clue because they're used to dealing with mainly private housing.
Yeah, and what you just described is the housing production team, which is one of the core recommendations of the owner report, which is essentially, we don't have that coordination between all these different areas of state government. We should have that. We should have that coordination. We should have some type of administrative structure. And there should be a specialized team of a lot of different, varied expertise that are really intended to partner with jurisdictions and make production happen.
Yep.
So no, you guys are like talking on a lot of the fuller body of recommendations that are also part of the thinking in the report. So thank you guys. It's good to know that there's some alignment there. But let's take maybe a step back. Jamie, is there
is there any other hands up on this one? We just need 5 minutes for a wrap up. Go ahead, Kathy.
No, I don't know how to take my hand down.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, this isn't as limited to this one, but Sean, you've referenced releasing a report today. Where is that going to be released and accessible?
Yeah, we're going to actually release a press release. We have a press release as well as the Gov delivery. And we'll, of course, be distributing it to a lot of people, including both the work groups. We'll be distributing it to, a series of legislators that we've been, kind of bringing through along the process, and just making sure it gets out to a very broad audience. And just worth noting too, we do have a comment window. You guys are welcome to provide comments on that document. Of course, also, you know, as work group members, you guys are welcome to just, you know, email me or send me to comments directly, that type of thing. And there are also some kind of community listening sessions. Again, as work group members, you guys are diving much more into the details than that conversation will be. But again, you're welcome to join those as well if you're interested. But
And Sean, what's the time frame for people to submit comments to you? I've got a couple questions in the chat about that.
yeah, so the comment window, we needed a time to, you know, all right, how are we going to, you know, hear back from the general public and be able to wrap these in to something that we can actually turn into a final draft by well, actually well in advance of our deadline, because that's how LPAC rolls. But we provided until October 3rd. That's not the end of like all feedback on the ONA or on these recommendations. That's just the window for this draft report, right? So don't feel like you need to get comments in, you know, by that time or that type of thing. It's really just a formal comment window for the specifics of the report.
Okay, Peggy, go ahead.
So the announcement that you're putting together, the ONA and this capacity report together, implies that the work that we did today is relatively, will show up. What you have done is going to show up in this report that you're going to do this afternoon. Even
Well,
though,
it eventually will. Right now, we just have the discussion draft recommendations in the appendix.
including what's in what we have been talking about today. That's my concern.
No, because yeah, I mean, obviously not. No, of course not. Because I can't write that all in, you know, well, it's already, I mean, the draft's already complete.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand. The document that we're going to get, you said, was the ONA and the housing capacity together.
Yep, it'll be an appendix item as well as a statewide basis for a housing production strategy. All of them are draft documents.
So this draft document will be an appendix to whatever it is you're sending out.
Yes, it is. It was the draft I circulated last week.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
It's
right.
going to be an appendix item to the report.
If
And
I
Peggy,
could,
oh, go ahead, Ethan, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that one of the recommendations in that overarching ONA recommendation umbrella is to incorporate the conversations that we are having here as part of this work group. So it is a core piece of that. I think it's like recommendation 1.4 or something, 1.4. And so that's just kind of a placeholder for as we are finalizing this kind of work, that'll be brought into, you know, raised up to that full 1.4 as we move forward.
On the sofa, I'll move stuff.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, Peggy, if the next slide that Sean's going to put up, and Sean, maybe go ahead and put up the next one about the schedule and what's happening next. Yeah, there you go. So, you know, at our next work group meeting, we'll be looking at refined recommendations, you know, based on input. And so that, you know, what I heard Sean saying is they're going to be gathering input on these documents, you know, simultaneously and then making refinements. And we'll be talking about that at the end of September. Is that fair, Sean?
Yeah. Yes. So in short, right, this feedback is going to be used to kind of develop a more set of refined recommendations and actually some specific statutory language by the next meeting, September 26th. And then the purpose of that is to kind of continue refining that and get into some of more of those specifics like we did today. And then in October 20th, we'll be having kind of a joint meeting. It's scheduled for 1 to 3 p.m., but in looking at it, you know, given that it's going to be two pretty large work groups, we should probably extend the time so that way we have enough time for conversation. So that will likely be longer, just so you guys are aware, where we kind of take a step back, hear the full recommendations. It's going to be moving on, right? Have a broader discussion about it. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions just about those next several meetings?
So let me follow up really quickly. So my concern is that we have spent 2 or so hours this afternoon providing you input on something that is now going to be out for full public view and not just within the smaller group of people. And
Yeah,
I just find that timing uncomfortable.
So, I mean, right, we pretty clearly note that these are draft documents. They're going to be changing as we refine them with the Housing Capacity Work Group. We're pretty clear on that in the draft report. And we are pretty clear just all throughout that these are very much in flux right now. So That is stated very much at the top of the document, and is is intended. We do have to. I wish we had more luxury of time to be able to sequence it, right? We have all of our conversations, we wrap it up, we publish a draft report, we leave it out for a very significant comment window. We come back, we take it all in together, we come back, we check in with the work groups, make sure that it's all okay and that we button it up and get it nicely sent out to the legislature. We were not given enough time to do that. So we have to make very difficult decisions, right, on timing.
Ethan, were you going to say something? You unmuted and muted and then unmuted. So
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Well, I was just going to say the attachment in the ONA recommendations document is the one that you have seen that's been published as part of this meeting today. So that has been for a week now been published and out in the open for public comment and review. So it's not anything new.
yeah,
It's just not going to have the refinements that we've talked about today.
Yeah, I
these
think
drafts are
Peg-
not internal to just this group. Sorry, Jamie.
I was gonna say, I think Peggy's concern is that, and Peggy, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like that, you think it would be helpful for people to hear some of the things that you've all talked about. We'll be doing the meeting summary of this group and that could be available for people to look at so they can see what they can benefit from the conversation that you've had today when they're considering the document under review. So there is a bit of a stacked review process happening.
I get it, and I get the whole timing thing. I respect it, and my hats off to Sean, Ethan, and the team for all the work that you all have done. It's just slightly frustrating being a public involvement person.
I wish I had a lot more time to do all of this. It's necessary, but I was not given that. So we have to keep moving, right?
And additionally, the meeting that we have with this group in particular, that's going to happen on the 26th of September. We have to, again, submit refinements to the conversation that we've had today, submit a public packet, and that'll be open or that'll be submitted 1 week prior. So on the 19th, that still gives folks time within that comment period window of October 3rd to respond to the refinements of the conversation that we've had today.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Ethan. And I saw Peggy give a thumbs up. So we've got best we can do. There's 1 minute left. Michael, you had your hand up, but then it went down. Did your question get answered?
Well, I just had another comment on the sort of controversial streamlined UGB expansion recommendation about 47. There's a lot of discussion about it. And I wondered if, earlier on this process at a previous meeting, I had suggested that the state agencies do more work in helping jurisdictions understand when land availability is actually a big part of the problem. And maybe if those processes if the fast track 4079 processes were limited to those kind of situations where the state agency had identified that land availability was a big part of the problem, maybe that would make less control.
Okay, thanks for that.
I appreciate that.
Sean, we're at time. Is there any last thing you would like to say?
No, just thank you all for the time that you guys spent here today. I want to be sensitive and get you guys out here, so I don't want to keep you guys too long. I appreciate the specific comments and feedback you provided on the draft recommendations. I think that we still have some things that we're going to need to work through, but I do appreciate the just the comments that you guys have provided. I think it's very, very helpful. And you guys are broad thinkers too, so appreciate that as well.
Yeah. All right. So have a good afternoon. Thanks again for everybody's time. And we will look forward to seeing you at the end of September.
Thank you.
Take care.